In the last section, we refactored our search bar to be a class instead of a functional component. We did this because we wanted the search bar to have some additional functionality that we'll talk more about inside of this section. Whenever a user is making use of a web application, they trigger events all the time. Events are something like, say the user moves the mouse around, or they click on an element, or they type something into an input. In this section, we're going to focus on just having the ability to detect whenever a user enters something into an input, like so. So when a user types something, we want to know that they typed something, and we also want to know what it was that they typed. Handling events in React has two steps. First, we declare an event handler. An event handler is a function that should be ran whenever the event occurs. Second, we pass the event handler to the element that we want to monitor for events. So in our case, we want to know whenever the input element inside of our search bar has its text changed. So let's get to it. First, we're going to define a function on the class that's going to run whenever the event occurs. And this is going to be our event handler. So we're going to define another method here, and it's going to have the same general syntax as the render method up here. We're going to call it onInputChange. In general, I recommend that you name your events something like this. So you can either do onInputChange, or also in the React community I see handle input change pretty often. Generally it's handle or on, then the name of the input, or excuse me, the name of the element that you're watching for an event, and then the name of the event itself. So in this case, it's very easy to tell the purpose of this method. Whenever the input changes, run the code inside of here. So the next thing we're going to do after declaring this event handler is pass it to the element that we want to monitor, which in this case is the input. So I'm first going to write some code in here, and then we'll talk about what's going on. So I'm going to write another space. I'm going to say on change equals this dot on input change. Okay, so all HTML elements all HTML input elements like this emit a change event, and I specifically say change because that's the name of the event, change, whenever the user interacts with them by typing something in. And that's not just a React thing, that's like a normal vanilla HTML in your browser thing. To tap into a vanilla event like that, like a normal browser event, all we have to do is write on, then the name of the event, then equals, curly braces, then the name of a reference to the method or the event handler, which is for us this dot on input change. Whenever we're writing JSX and we're using JavaScript variables, which this dot input changes, we wrap it with curly braces. Don't forget the curly braces here, and I'll point these curly braces out many different times. So again, what this does is it says create a new input element and pass it what we'll refer to basically is as a prop, a prop or property on change with a value of this dot on input change. Okay, so we've now declared our our event handler, and we've passed that event handler to the element that we want to watch for the event. So let's go ahead and right here on the on input change, I'm going to add one argument in here, and we're going to call it event. All browser events that get triggered by native elements like input or say a div or span or button or what have you, whenever we add a event handler, they're always called with an event object. And this doesn't actually have to be named event. We can name it anything we want. It could be just E or event object or what have you. Just usually we end up calling it event. The event object describes the context or information about the event that occurred. So it's got a lot of very specific, very technical properties inside of it. Specifically, in this case, since we have an input element, we can use this event object to get access to the value of the input. So basically, what the text was that was changed. So let's go ahead and try to console log that. I'm going to add console.log. And then to get access to the value of the input, we'll write event.target.value. All right, so let's go ahead and save this, refresh the browser, and then type something out. And you'll see inside of my console on the right-hand side here, whatever I type into the input gets console logged as well. Cool, so this looks good. So let's run through the process here one more time. We have an input element, and we want to add an event handler to it. The event handler will be triggered whenever the event occurs. Specifically, we want to watch for the change event on the input. So to get access to the change input, we write on change. This is a protected, or this is like a React defined property right here. This is a special property. And you can find out more info about other events inside the React docs. Once we specify the event name, we then say equals, curly braces, and then the function, or excuse me, the event handler, which is this dot on input change. Then inside of the class, we define another method for the input handler, the event handler, and we choose to add the argument here event, because most event handlers are called with this event object. And we can use that event object to kind of divine or introspect, kind of just get more information about the event that just occurred. So we can write console log and then event.target.value. Just to show you a little bit more about the event object itself, I'm going to delete the target.value. So we're just going to console log the whole event object. I'm going to refresh, and I'm going to just type once. You'll see we get this object here. So we can look at some of the different properties, and you can see it's just chock full of a bunch of different stuff going on here. The target property is the one that we used, which is specifically a reference to the input. You can see when I hover over it, on the top left, the input tag gets highlighted. And so if we write basically input.value, that returns the value inside of the input. Okay, so this looks great. I like it a lot. There's just one little refactor I want to do just to give you a little bit more exposure to some ES6 arrow functions. So right now, we've got an event handler that's defined as a method on the class, but the console log that we're doing here is just really simple, really straightforward, just a tiny snippet of code. So we're going to use an arrow function to just condense the code in here, just to make it look a little bit more compact. We might change it back later on, if we need to, but I just want to take this opportunity to show it to you. So first, I'm going to add back on the target.value here. And then up here, inside of my function handler, I'm going to delete the existing function that we're passing. And I'm instead going to write an arrow function. So I'll write event as the argument, then my arrow, and then I'll just copy paste this entire line. And I'm going to drop off the semicolon on there as well. And then I'll go ahead and delete the entire handler down here, like so. Okay, so I'm going to flip back over, let's refresh, and I still get my console log. I can even clean this up a little bit more. Whenever we have a single line arrow function, you'll notice I didn't use an additional set of curly braces on here. If I have a single argument, I can also drop off these leading parentheses like so. So I'm going to save this, and then type, and you can see it still works just fine. So by using arrow functions, we can really clean up our code a lot. This is just remarkably less code than what we had before when we had this separate on input change method defined inside the class. So we'll use the arrow functions like this, every now and then throughout this course. Just be aware that you'll find that syntax in a lot of different React apps, just because it's so concise. Okay, so now that we got our event added on here, let's continue in the next section.